So, welcome to the podcast, JD. It's great to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Let's kick off with a bit of an introduction, if that's okay. So, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure, I'm JD. I live in Orlando, Florida in the US. I'm a movie theater and theme park manager turned L&D professional, turned technologist, turned advisor, speaker, and author. And my latest project is the Frontline Enablement Playbook, the first blueprint for helping frontline workers and deskless workers do their very best every day. And I collaborated with more than 100 people, but 50 contributor authors are in the book, and it's coming out May 5th. I'm very excited to help elevate the conversation around the frontline workforce because my entire 25-year career has been spent in service of helping frontline workers.
Brilliant. Well, you've also just named the topic of our conversation today. So, let's kick off with some questions, if that's okay. And I like to kind of get stuck in there with some quick fire questions to begin with. So, you've spent a lot of time working with frontline teams. What's something about their work that people in head office always underestimate?
There is no such thing as a perfect shift. And I had that experience when I was a frontline employee and a frontline manager in the fact that you go into the day with a plan. You're working certain hours, certain tasks to accomplish today. Something at the start of the day is very important today. And then things happen. People call in sick. There's unexpected rush of customers or guests. The weather impacts your operation. The delivery truck is late. Something's going to happen that's going to disrupt that day, which is going to turn the shift into just trying to do your best to accomplish whatever the desired outcome is or hit your target metrics for that particular hour, that particular day. And I think in a lot of cases, corporate teams design for this SOP driven operation that's supposed to work a particular way without acknowledging the fact that there is no normal shift, there is no average day. And the experience level, motivation level, engagement level, capability levels of their frontline teams vary considerably location to location and even shift to shift. So hopefully we can think a little bit more about the reality that we're designing for and that we're planning for, and less about what looks good on paper or what the operation is meant to be on a given day.
Yeah, fair enough. And for anyone who's worked in customer facing frontline roles, even just who walks through the door, right? Who are the customers of the day is going to shake it up and change what happens, right? So finish this sentence for me, if you will. If L&D wants to genuinely support frontline workers, what's the first thing that they need to stop doing?
Stop making assumptions about works for frontline employees. And I know that is often challenging to do because a lot of people who support frontline workers come from the frontline operation. And there's huge value in having that experience and that level of expertise to inform the way that we support people. But it also becomes very easy to assume that what would have worked for me will work for people today. And the further removed you are from the day to day reality, the harder it is to just unilaterally make assumptions about what is going to work. So if we can get away from making the assumption and get more integrated with the people who are doing the job, we'll do a better job supporting the people doing the job.
Yeah, that makes sense. So on the flip side, then, we're not going to lump all frontline workers together, but generally speaking, what's one thing that you think frontline workers actually value most when it comes to learning and development, and what should they be getting more of?
Support in the moment. So real time support, as well as support in managing through change, whether that be the release of a new product, a new process, a new compliance requirement. Something changes inside of frontline operations every day. And as you said, there's unexpected situations that you face, constantly new promotions. It's a constantly evolving machine in the frontline operation. And oftentimes it's hard for L&D with traditional tools and tactics to keep pace with that level of change. Or there's only, there's so many demands on the operation, so many employees and locations to support, and only so many people in a learning or support function. So it's hard for us to go after every possible challenge that every person might face. So rethinking the systems of learning and enablement so that we can do a better job of being there when people need us, rather than asking for people to be there when we want them to be there, I think is a better place to start our story when it comes to enabling the front line versus the more programmatic approach that I think a lot of us have taken for a long time.
And we're talking about a huge mass of people, right? Like 80% of the working population, I think, are in like frontline roles. So, and we've already, you've started to give a sense that every day can be different, but you've also got this huge diverse audience mixed in. So before we go any further, like, can you help just paint a picture of what we're talking about when we say frontline? Who are we talking about, I guess?
You're absolutely correct in the fact that the frontline workforce is not one thing. A lot of different people doing different types of work in different types of contexts and situations. The way that I commonly define frontline worker, it's the people who work directly with your customers, your products, or your services every day. Some people define it based on the fact that a lot of people have to physically be in the environment to work. They don't have the option to work hybrid or remote. Some people look more at the deskless side of work, which the majority of people who work in frontline roles don't work behind a desk, have inconsistent access to technology. But for me, it's that consistency that their job, what they spend their time doing, is working directly with the products they're manufacturing and delivering, the customers that they're serving every day, executing delivery services or home repair services. So they live in the world of your products, your services, and your customers day to day.
And in your book, I think you describe some case studies, some day in the lives of various frontline workers. Can you pick one or two of those for us now and kind of bring it to life a little bit?
Sure. I open the book early on by telling the story of a very kind of typical frontline day. We started out by saying there is no average day, but what does the experience of work look like? And I share frontline stories throughout the book directly from people who are doing this work, because I think it's important to level set us in not, again, the assumption of what the reality is or what the job is supposed to be, but what the lived experience is. Because I think we often see the work, but we don't necessarily see the experience of the people behind the work, especially when they're not clocked in and working with our organization, wearing our logo on their chest. So I start with the story of a woman who, she says in the story, has had 36 different frontline jobs since she was 16 years old. When she told the story, she was in her early 30s. And she talks about how, she spends her evening one night closing. She's a bartender at an Italian restaurant, and she's scheduled to work until a particular time. But in a lot of cases, frontline roles, you're there until you're done. So she has to complete side work and count the register and do all these different tasks. Gets home about midnight, is up at 7 a.m. the next day to go to her next job, where she's going to spend 6 to 8 hours working with customers, cleaning equipment on that particular shift. And then she gets in her car. She actually takes a nap for 45 minutes in her car between going from that job to her final job of the day, which she works in a cosmetic store in a mall as a salesperson. So in the course of 24 hours, she's worked for 3 different companies doing 3 different jobs. And she wraps up the story by talking about why she does that. And she says, in some cases, it's great to work for different companies, get different perks, different discounts, free meals, but ultimately it comes down to she's worked this way since she was 16 because this is how she pays her bills. She doesn't really have a choice between balancing so many different roles. And if you just kind of think about the human experience, not just from a physical exhaustion perspective, what it takes to do those types of jobs, moving around town, driving between locations, working with demanding customers every day, also just the amount of switching between knowledge and skill sets, right? Going from mixing drinks at a bar to then selling cosmetics to working with customers in an entertainment venue and cleaning equipment. How much this person has to know in order to be able to execute different standards at different companies, wearing different uniforms the whole time and delivering on kind of different brand standards. So that's one example of, in her story, there's no big highs or lows, no major disruptions, no major events. There's another story in the book. I talk about a flight attendant's first day on the job out of training. They had to physically take a passenger down at 35,000 feet and got into a brawl in the galley on their first day. And the story of, how did you know what to do? Because they don't teach you to fight in airline training, right? But this person figured out the situation and overcame the challenge. That's a very different story than this one individual who's just kind of living their average day. But their average day is very demanding for a variety of different reasons. And even if we don't support her in all of those companies that she works for, maybe I'm the learning and development team in one of those organizations, I do have to take into account the human experience of her day, because it's impacting her ability to do each of those jobs. And she requires the right support as a result to be able to do her best, because she wants to do a good job for all those organizations. But we have to provide the support that fits the reality that she's living as someone who's executing our strategy in those different organizations.
And I wonder how much of that reality is taken in or appreciated, because we often hear that, frontline workers are time poor, or learning time isn't contracted. We only have 15 minutes, for example, in the contract, or it can be done outside of the contract, for example, quite often. We have to limit it. But isn't there more to the idea of the challenge, like fitting in learning for these people? Like, as you just said, there's so much more that can be going on, the stresses that can be there, the kind of challenges around a lot of the frontline work.
That's another reason why it's critical to make the investment in spending time and having conversations with people who do the job every day, not making those assumptions, and bringing people who do the work and can represent that voice and that perspective into the conversation whenever we're creating strategy or deciding on a solution or acquiring a new technology or building a new program. Having their voice in the room. And again, one of the things I like to reinforce is not bringing in frontline employees that the management team recommends. I always love to go find the people that are respected by their peer group, the people that are the go-tos, the people who are propping up the operation in ways that the corporate team doesn't see. And in a lot of cases, those people might be challenging because they're carrying so much, because they care so much. They're willing to push, right? They're willing to raise their hand on a regular basis. And sometimes they're willing to make trouble as a result. But those voices are critical in understanding what the day-to-day reality is like and how that does or does not align with how we're going to try to help them solve a problem as part of their job. And you mentioned one of the biggest obstacles to overcome with frontline workers is just the nature of the job being so operationally focused, so structured, and so micromanaged, because labor hours being one of the biggest budgetary levers that any organization has, they only schedule the number of people they need in order to serve customers and to hit the KPIs for the day. One person calling in completely changes the story of that particular shift. And you may think, well, we scheduled a 30-minute training 3 months in advance. Why couldn't they get it done? What else has happened to this team in that period of time that has caused them to deprioritize something that they didn't perceive as helping them, not necessarily from a long-term perspective, because frontline work, it's not even a weekly focus, or it's not even a daily focus. It's often measured hourly. It's what's going to help me hit the goal in the next hour, and then the following hour, and then the following hour. And we have to build into that reality and respect that reality, and align solutions with how the job is done, because in a lot of cases, we're constrained to what people can do between clock in and clock out. That's the time we have available. Getting people to add time on the edges of that is often difficult because of the example from that story I shared earlier. They have lives. They have a second job they have to go to, or they're just tired. I worked with an organization that works in automotive training, where they're supporting organizations that are kind of small repair shops. And trying to schedule training after hours doesn't work because people just worked a full shift. They may be very interested in learning this information. They just can't, because they're not being set up for success in that regard. So we have to think about our solutions differently to fit it into those constraints. Because even if you do work in an environment or in a region where people are allowed to do something off the clock, which is in a lot of cases not permitted, doesn't mean they can. It doesn't mean they're not also, they don't also have demands from other employment. They don't also have demands from their family life, right? Maybe they work 12 hours for you today, then they have to go home and take care of their family. It doesn't mean just providing them access to information or the opportunity to engage in an education program means they can actually take advantage of it. And that's that human experience we have to take into account.
And I think we'll get into this more as we get into the conversation, but there's kind of like the fitting it in problem, right? And then there's like, is it actually driving impact? So I've done work in the past with oil and gas, people who worked out on oil rigs and needed their training. That's a challenging setup. And so what would often happen is that when those people were off shift, so they're back on the mainland, they would get 3 days of training all in one go. Like it would get crammed in. And you can imagine how much of that did not stick and did not necessarily make a difference, but also it's out of context, right? It's not where they have to apply it, and they're not with the peers that they work with normally. So yeah, there's a fit problem. I think sometimes we get obsessed with how do we fit this in, which is definitely a good question to ask, isn't it, with frontline? Because it's a challenge, but it's not the only angle to look at. But yeah, I'm keen to pick your brains, I guess. Like, let's say a central L&D team, a kind of head office L&D team, if you like, has some training to roll out. It could be compliance or like a policy update, something for everybody. What does that story look like, do you think, when it lands with some frontline teams versus those that might, receive it in head office? Like, how well does centrally rolled out learning usually land, do you think?
Too often it's an exercise in logistics than it is an exercise in meaningfully supporting people's ability to consume information, retain that information, then apply that information on the job. Because if you think about corporate team members, back to that challenge of time, but also the challenge of autonomy, we can make decisions about how we spend our time. We can decide, oh, there's a 30-minute online course I'm expected to complete. I'll do that at 4 o'clock on Friday. Frontline employees don't get that choice. Right? They can't control what they do once they clock in for the shift because they're so micromanaged and operationally focused, because that's how these operations run. So to get people to complete some type of activity is both a logistical exercise in terms of making the labor hours available, scheduling people to have that time out of the operation. In some organizations I've worked with, you also have to buffer that time with walk time because they physically have to go from the place where they do their job to the place where they can access a computer or where the classroom is or what have you. So now there's a bigger amount of time buffering around that experience, all of which comes with dollar signs attached to it. And then we have to ensure it actually happens, which requires us collaborating with the frontline management team who actually controls day-to-day priorities and how people use their time. Because if we have 3 people scheduled to go to a training today and 3 people call in sick, I'm pulling those 3 people out of the training, which means, well, now we got to go through the logistical exercise again. So that's a great example of this idea of, instead of looking at that as an obstacle or looking at that as a source of frustration and, oh, managers just aren't bought in, why won't they do what we need them to do? We have to design for that is going to happen because it's just the reality of how these operations function. So whether that's rethinking the types of support that we provide, in my case, I like to default to accessible resources first, making sure people have the ability to pull information, be able to raise their hand and ask questions to help them manage their way through a particular problem or particular change. Because those types of solutions I can fit. I don't require to pull people out of the operation, to just make it easier to find and use information. And then on top of that, build out the situations where, okay, now we do need to do some type of structured activity, whether it's a simulation, we need to do some practice exercises, we need a full-blown course or program or hands-on job training exercise, because it is one of those situations where it's a complex topic, it requires that level of support, it's a compliance subject, and they said you have to do the 45-minute course to check the box. But we're building on top of scaffolding that makes it easier for people to engage with information, to find help, to refine their own understanding, and use their own problem-solving skills. Because I can fit that into the experience of work day to day and make it less often and more of an exception for me to have to disrupt the operation and cause that logistical exercise to happen. Still going to happen. Still an important part of the story. But it should be something that has clear value. That when you say to that manager, I need 3 of your people for 2 hours for this training, because we only ask when it's something that's going to be helpful to them and important to us, and we're very transparent about how we message those things, they're going to be more likely to support because they see the value, and it's not just, oh, what does the learning and development team need to do now?
And do you think there is that kind of difference in culture, or perception of the kind of head office, the stuff from above that comes that doesn't quite fit in? When you think of when I've worked in frontline, it's almost like there's a culture there with your team that's what you hold on to, right? That there's your kind of buddies, and you're kind of in your own world in some ways.
Well, 50% of frontline employees think that companies prioritize corporate employees over them. There's a clear us versus them mentality that takes place. Mm-hmm. And it comes from that idea, in my perspective, in my experience. It's less about including everyone in the story, treating everyone the same way, and it's more about respecting what you said, which is the fact that community and connection is local on the front line. The corporate office, whether you're all physically in one building or maybe you're dispersed, some hybrid folks, some remote folks, but you're all part of these different teams and these different functions. And there's a source of connection wrapped around kind of the specialty role that you play within this particular function. What's interesting, you think about corporate teams, just making up these numbers, but generally speaking, maybe you have 1,000 people who work at corporate. They probably do 900 different jobs because everyone's kind of a specialist in their particular role. In the frontline space, you might have 10,000 employees who do 10 jobs because they share that experience because of the nature and the scale of frontline work. But even location to location, culture is brought to life by the individuals who are there at that moment and facilitated by the manager who is overseeing that operation. And I always say frontline workers don't work for your company. They work for their manager. They don't work in service of your KPIs and corporate goals. They work in service of one another and their shared success. Yes, they're absolutely professionals. They understand the importance of hitting goals, but they're not doing it for the success of teams they can't see and results they don't share in. They're doing it for the pride of doing a good job and helping one another succeed. And if their manager does their job really well, in service of helping that manager succeed, because they know what managers go through, how hard it is to do that job. I've had tons in my own experience as a manager, tons of employees say to me, jokingly, that's why you get paid the big bucks. Like, no, I don't. And some people have said to me, well, I'm happy I'm not you, because I was dealing with a particularly challenging situation. And they see what people in those roles go through. And if you do your job as a manager to enable and support the team, they'll support you and be empathetic back in your direction. So it's that understanding from corporate to say, it's not one shared community. It's not one group of people. How many locations do you have? That's how many communities exist within your operation. How can you enable those communities to thrive and then create connective tissue that matters between the day-to-day work that people are doing and the larger purpose and mission and the value that they're generating, even if they can't see it as part of their day-to-day tasks.
And just picking up on something you said there, which it is kind of true that lots of frontline workers are all doing the same job as each other, right? There's hundreds upon hundreds, working in a factory or in shops across the different countries around the world, etc., kind of doing the same thing. What does a career progression look like? And also, haven't you got high turnover going on in that situation too? So I guess what I'm getting into is, when it comes to motivation for learning or the idea of upskilling, like, what's the reality really for most frontline workers in that picture?
One of the most surprising parts when I deliver sessions for people who support frontline workers is that I get almost universal head nodding when I reflect on this particular question in a very practical and frank way. When I say organizations need to recognize that a large number of your frontline employees are just there because they need the paycheck. Everyone in that room violently head nods.
There you go. I did it as well.
Because I think it's something that we, for some reason, have this assumption. And you see it in job ads too. You go to the local fast food restaurant, anywhere where they're hanging a sign outside the establishment because they're hiring, usually it says something about competitive pay, which we know. Let's put a giant question mark next to that one. And then something about career opportunity, like promotion opportunity. Almost never on that sign do you see something to the effect of, we're going to do our best to make sure you have a good day every day. It's always about this kind of future focused idea. And that math doesn't math. If you have 10,000 employees across all of these different locations, well, you only have one manager in that location. So every person can't become a manager. They might be able to become a trainer or a key holder or whatnot, but there's not a straight climb up for every person in that building. And there's also not necessarily opportunities outside in the corporate space because the math doesn't math. So I think it's critical to recognize both sides of that story, which is a lot of people are in this job because they need to be, because this is the workplace closest to the house. They don't have great transportation. The manager is great here. I love asking frontline employees, why do you stay? Especially if there's a place maybe across the street that's offering more money. Often people reflect immediately on the people. I like the people here. The manager's really good to me. Perfect. A lot of people are very happy working in these jobs. I worked with people at Disney who worked there for 30, 40 years. They were really good at what they did and they loved what they did. They didn't aspire to something else. They aspired to have a great experience where they were. And they were hugely impactful. And I relied on them every day. That's great. And then there are people who do want to see opportunity. Everyone deserves a chance to understand what opportunities exist. And we have to build a system that doesn't assume that if you don't start to climb, if you don't want to become a manager, you're not worth investment. We're not going to help you do your best work and be proud of your work because you're not kind of meeting some preconceived notion of a career path. So I think it's important to balance those two sides where everyone deserves a chance to understand what advancement can look like. They shouldn't have to kind of carve that path themselves or have to go figure out, where could I go from here and what does that look like? It should be easy to find. And then at the same time, you shouldn't have to want to build a career here to have a positive experience and to be able to be proud of what you're doing. And across all of that, One thing I find to be consistently true is that everyone wants to do a good job. I've met thousands of frontline employees over the years. I've never met someone who wants to go to work and get in trouble, who wants to get hurt, who wants to get yelled at. Everyone wants to do a good job, but people have varying levels of connection to that job, to that work, varying levels of motivations for why they are there. And I think we have to feed into that reality and build a system that enables and supports that reality, rather than assume, oh, we're going to lean on the top performers who we can put on an emerging leader path, and the rest of the folks, they're going to turn over anyway.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I guess you've got a lot of people coming, straight out of school or straight out of college, as well, getting into those kind of entry level roles, and the idea that there's no opportunities on the plate for them is a sad one, right? So, yeah, I think that's a good point to make. Earlier, you started to talk a little bit about. You started to hint about what you thought good learning could look like, for frontline. So resources that they can draw on when needed, which is really important, partly because it gives autonomy as well, like some choice, which you talked about is kind of rare, to have that kind of flex. But you also mentioned kind of simulations and things, or deeper dive learning. I want to go into this a little bit more, but I guess before I ask you what else might be on the plate, or on the wish list for learning for frontline, let's just get real about the tech setup. So I've been to those dusty back rooms in retail stores where people come to do their training with some old desktop computer and posters on the walls, and they have to take it in turns, right? And I think that's still the case in some situations. I'm keen to get your thoughts. But I've also seen in retail people, fashion retail, for example, with their phones out and they're using them on the job. So where are things at? Like, I imagine there's a scale, right? But what are you seeing?
One of my favorite professional moments was when I was visiting a grocery store and I was in their training room. So it was basically a set of cubicles with desktop computers. And it's me, the L&D person, and the owner of that chain of stores. And we're standing there, and in front of us is a new employee who is completing e-learning on the desktop computer and just staring at TikTok on their phone, just not even caring. It was one of my favorite moments because it's just emblematic of the challenge that we're facing, right? They were just left alone to click next to continue, and they have alternatives and they're going to take them because they don't see value in what they're being asked to experience. And I would say that the technology story has advanced meaningfully on the front line in the past several years, in a lot of ways precipitated by the pandemic and the business model adaptations that took place as a result. So we saw retailers get more into online ordering, curbside pickup, right? The access to devices and the willingness to start to think about personal devices differently changed a lot during that period of time. But the frontline still has inconsistent access to technology. A screen is just not part of the workflow for every employee, and it might be meaningfully different inside of one environment. So let's go back to the grocery store example. If you work as a cashier, you're staring at a screen because the cash register is an internet-connected device with a touch screen. If you work in the deli, a lot of people don't know this, but the back of deli scales, the side you can't see, that's a big touch screen. And the deli scale is connected to the internet too. That's how they know how much the products cost. So you can actually use that as an access point to access information as well. I walk into any frontline environment, I just sense where the screens are because it's what I've been doing for so many years. But maybe you're a cart runner. You work the front end, you're bagging groceries and you're going out to the parking lot and grabbing carts. You don't use a screen as part of your job. Maybe you're a stock clerk and you're stocking shelves and pulling product from the back, or you work in the produce department. You might not be using a screen as part of your job. So even inside of one frontline operation, the access to technology is different based on how people do their jobs. And again, that's a consideration that we have to take when it comes to designing frontline enablement is one, I talk a lot more about a choose your own device reality than like a BYOD approach, or even just relying on corporate devices, because we can't assume everyone has a device that they can use for work or they want to use for work. There are environments where you can't pull your phone out. So let's say we're back in the grocery store, you work in the meat department, you're not pulling your phone out in that environment. That's how things get broken and things get real dirty. So how do we think about the kind of device reality of frontline operations that we support Where are there access points that people can use to access information, pull up short form content, complete a quick activity if we need them to reinforce certain information? And then where are there opportunities for people to pull their own devices and use them on the job? And how do we eliminate the stigma associated to that? Because there are still a lot of organizations that struggle with the, well, if customers see people on their phones thing. You mentioned that you go into a lot of environments now. Part of the job is holding a mobile device and scanning products or looking up information to answer customer questions. I think customers are past it as long as people are using those devices purposefully and they pay attention to when customers need them. So it's less about the device and it's more about accountability and expectations and making sure that there's value to promoting people's use on the device. And I've seen organizations that did not launch a personal device strategy at all. And then 95% of their employees figure out how to use their own phones to do things because your favorite device is the one that you carry around all the time. So we can't assume that everyone's going to do it. But I think a choose your own device strategy maximizes access for digital purposes while leveraging the fact that a large number of employees across spaces have access to their own phone. But then again, you also have to consider things like connectivity. Are we supporting construction workers? Mm-hmm. Do they have access to the internet out there? Can we put mobile access points and satellite connectivity on sites in order to activate that type of? So there's an infrastructure conversation and a hardware conversation in frontline enablement we just don't have when it comes to corporate learning and development. We just assume screens and internet connectivity are there for the most part. And then the last thing I'll wrap up is, not making the assumption that learning is a digital concept in frontline work. Still, the most important modality for learning and enablement is hands-on job training. You don't learn how to do drywall on the internet. You don't learn how to weld on the internet. We can use technology to support these experiences, to make sure people can find information, get guidance to walk through a particular challenge, something they can't remember, walk through a structured training process using a digital checklist while they're doing the practice hands-on, but make sure that we're putting just as much effort into making sure people have a great hands-on training experience, not defaulting to, well, Bob will show you how it works. Bob's worked here forever. Bob might be horrible at conveying information, or Bob has a lot of this is how we really do it here's that creates inconsistent practices and puts people at risk. So we have to put just as much, if not more effort into ensuring the quality of the hands-on experience, the coaching experience, things that take place on site, because that's where the job is done. And then supporting that with a digital infrastructure that makes those experiences that much more impactful.
Yeah, that makes sense. And where's the case? We've done quite well. I don't think we've mentioned AI yet at all.
It's a record for a podcast in this year.
40 minutes, no mention. But you have mentioned the word simulation, and I've seen some examples out there of AI coaching being used in simulations in certain places where it might fit. Yeah, what's your take on that? What role do you think that AI tech and simulations and things like that can play?
There are a variety of obstacles that have hindered us for years, especially when it comes to enabling frontline workers, that AI already can take off the table. One of my favorite things to talk about is language translation. There are so many instances where people cannot properly understand and consume information, yet alone learn and apply that information because there's a barrier of language, and an organization which has historically had to deal with the fact that language translation is time-consuming and expensive, have been making assumptions and saying, well, the 4 most popularly spoken languages in this company are these 4. We'll translate information to these 4, everyone else. And we don't know who we're leaving behind in a lot of cases. And when I was a technology provider, one of my favorite things to do was to pull information about all of our users and look at what languages people were using inside of our technology, because we supported 70-ish languages in the platform. And my favorite thing was finding companies where one person was using a language. And you might think of that as, well, that's underutilization. Why are they automating the translation to that? That's the point, is that this technology now allows us to say we don't have to spend specific resources for one individual. We can scale against this problem now, and language translation and automation is good enough. It still requires a level of review, especially if it's formal, compliance-heavy, complex content with a lot of nuance, corporate language in it. There's still a review element in there, to be sure. But social exchanges, less formal information, that's something AI can handle now. And I use language translation tools for my own content when I'm engaging online with people from different countries, delivering presentations in different languages, and it hasn't failed me yet. So we're in a completely different place when it comes to that. But there's also a level of this on the front line when you think about maybe it's not language, maybe it's just reading skills.
Mm-hmm.
You might just not be a great reader. And then you have an SOP written by a lawyer for lawyers. What am I looking at? So we can use this technology to change information and distill it down in a way that's more easily consumed by an individual based on factors like their preferred reading level. Take it another step further. Maybe you're just not a great reader. You can talk to it now.
Mm-hmm.
So now you can just ask the machine a question in your preferred language and get the answer back based on that information that may be difficult to understand, but distilled in a way that makes sense to you. So I think there's a lot of these kind of systems improvements that AI is allowing us to make in how we enable frontline workers. And that's before we start talking about things like personalization or things like coaching. But just that idea that we can engage with information as an individual in different ways and unlock that door. I think back to my time as a frontline employee and frontline manager. There were so many team members that I worked with who did not speak the language that I was speaking very well. Not just how much better a conversation we could have had about the work, but how much different our connection would have been if I had some of the technology available today, like the new AirPods as an example, that you can put in and automatically start to translate what you're hearing into the language that you prefer. We are so close to being able to overcome an obstacle that I think has been a barrier across the board, but especially in frontline workplaces where that level of variety exists inside of one location. So in a manufacturing facility, you may have 10 different languages spoken in that environment. There's no way the management team speaks 10 different languages. And in my book, there's examples of organizations that literally would pay friends and family members of employees to come to training with new hires and handle the language translation for them because they didn't have the technology component of it available, but they were finding ways to accommodate people because they know how much of a barrier that can be because people are so focused on just understanding. They can't possibly start to learn and apply. So I'm excited about that side of the AI conversation, but equally, there's a lot of opportunity around the more advanced agentic conversation about what we can do with these tools to make sure people can get the right fit support.
Yeah. It's great, isn't it? Like it puts the word access into accessibility in a different way, right? It's the democratization, it's a kind of fairness application that's never been there before. And that's, for that one person that spoke that one language, right? Can you imagine what a lonely corner that is if that's the case as well? So that could be the only way to get kind of communications that make any sense from head office or elsewhere to kind of come through. So
I'm very curious. And I haven't seen any research on this yet. I think we're still early in the story. But when the avatar conversation began, I have several avatars of myself that I've used in different settings. One of the settings I used it in was I did a presentation in South Korea. The audience primarily spoke Korean. I don't speak Korean. And I didn't want to try because I was not going to do a great job. So I brought my avatar in to do my intro for me in Korean. And then I delivered the presentation in English with captions in Korean. And I'm very curious about how people perceive information that's delivered by a synthetic person. So it could be, in some of my avatars, it's me, but it's my mouth is being replaced by the language that I'm being translated live into. And in some cases, it's a fully digital version of me and I was never actually there. I just scripted the information and then fake voice and fake person delivered it. And I'm very curious because imagine a world where today your CEO sends a message out to the entire company. The CEO likely doesn't speak every language that every employee speaks in your company. And they record it once, probably in English. And then everyone receives that information. Now, you could caption it in a variety of languages so people could read along, but maybe that's not a fair experience, not an equitable experience. It's different. And then some people might not be great readers. So what if you did use the avatar technology? And it sounds like we're doing the movie Avatar. Say if you used avatars and your CEO can now speak every language, and you do have an individual in the team who is one of the few people who prefers a particular language, but now the CEO can speak their language. I'm very curious. Does that come across authentically? Like they know that person can't speak this language. They didn't actually say these words, but now I can understand the message that's
Mhm.
being conveyed by management. How does that come across? I'm very
It's, a,
curious.
it's an interesting one when it comes to language, because we've got a little bit of data around it because we've just released our State of Digital Learning report, and where we survey employees across enterprise organizations as well as L&D practitioners, and employees rated AI generated learning, which means AI generated that they've detected, which I would imagine would be more of the avatar approach, rather, because in other areas I shouldn't be able to tell unless it's got those funny hyphens that we keep seeing, the M dashes.
I love
But,
dashes. I'm a
yeah,
defender of the dash.
no, I know I am too.
Yeah.
But like the data says that that they're rating it kind of fair to middling in terms of how well it's landing,
Mhm.
and the question is often one of trust. So,
Yeah.
do they trust what they're seeing? But I wonder if it's different, and it'd be good to do a study on what if it's delivering it in your language though, and
Yeah.
so there's forgiveness isn't the right word, but an acceptance that it's helping you in other ways. You can suddenly lip read, right? If
Yeah.
it's done in a different language, if the avatar's done well. Um, Whereas with captioning, you can't, right? It's purely you're left to read, as you say, and there's different reading levels. So,
If
yeah, there's
anyone
a
out
study
there,
there. Yeah.
if anyone out there wants a research project, I would love to see a study where you take a message from a corporate executive, deploy it towards a frontline workforce in 3 different versions. There's an English speaking version, no language translation at all. There's an English speaking version, language translation captions. There's an avatar version with live speaking in that language. How do people perceive, the trustworthiness of that information? How engaging is it? Do they retain the information? Do they apply the information differently? I'm very curious about that. I did this exercise in a presentation early on when we started talking about generative AI, where I had an avatar of Santa Claus. It was British AI Santa Claus. And I had him say some information about a learning and development topic. And then I revealed the fact that there was a very respected thought leader in learning and development whose words those actually were. And I put them side by side. And my thought experiment was, does it matter? Like, of course, British AI Santa Claus is ridiculous, right? It's not meant to be an authentic version of the story, but the information was the same. It had the same value, but does it come across with the same level of value and trustworthiness based on the fact that it's coming out of different people's mouths in different ways? So again, we'd love to see this if anyone has this research or would like to do it.
And of course, Santa Claus is real. So, that experiment's flawed anyway, right? But yeah, moving on.
Yes. One of the dumbest things I've said out loud in a presentation was, do you believe British AI Santa Claus? Just, you had to be there.
As long as it wasn't in front of school kids, it's fine. So I want to ask you then, like, some recommendation questions. So for L&D teams and leaders that are out there, what change could they make tomorrow that you think would make learning easier for frontline workers?
I think even without having to make big systems changes, having to meaningfully evolve tools and tactics and things like that, I think we can do a better job reflecting the reality of the people we support in our existing materials and existing solutions. So in my new book, I have a very simple example of this, which is it's just a multiple choice scenario question. And it's about a customer demanding a refund. I say, here's the version that you often see in the e-learning. And again, it comes back to what I said in the beginning. It's just a reality doesn't exist. It's one of those situations where they're very upset. The employee regurgitates the policy exactly as you want them to. And then the customer is suddenly like, thank you so much for helping me today. That's never happened in real life. And then I write a second version of the exact same scenario with slight tweaks where the customer is a little bit more abrasive, because the number one challenge frontline employees face today is customer incivility. It's not even pay. It's the fact of how they're treated by people on the job,
Mhm.
which just continues to be an increasingly difficult situation. So the customer's a little bit more abrasive, uses a little bit harsher language, but I didn't go over the line of HR, because HR is not going to let you say the things people actually say in real life, but a little bit more direct. The employee's response is a little bit more realistic in terms of how people actually talk. It's still right. It's still a policy, but it's the way that people convey that information that sounds more grounded. And then the customer is not super enthused at the end of the situation. They're begrudgingly satisfied, because usually someone doesn't go from, I'm incredibly angry at you, to I'm very happy about the situation. Sometimes, if you're really good at customer service, but not on the average. And it's just something like that, so that when people engage with the content you share, complete courses or programs, they can see their reality. It reflects their day-to-day experience back at them, and they are likely to be more accepting and engaged with that information versus what I would call corporate fluff. So my other recommendation is delete the second slide in everything that we do, because the second slide usually is the at company XYZ. We believe that it's corporate stuff. It's the
Yeah.
things you don't have to say, but someone in marketing or a subject matter expert, product owner thinks it's really important, but it immediately starts to disengage people who don't have time for this, who are used to a form of content that just gets to the point. I'm not saying anything has to be TikTok, but just go watch TikTok. What should you learn? They get to the point.
Yeah.
It's just, here's what you need. I'm out of here. Take that same approach, because that's what people demand in these roles. But be very frank and grounded and honest and say, here's what we're doing. Everything doesn't have to be the corporate color. Everything doesn't have to have the logo on it. They know where they work. And everything doesn't have to be like imbued with this kind of sense of mission values. The best way to communicate and to share your values with frontline team members is to live it in the experience that they have on the job every day, not to open your onboarding training with the history of the company,
Yeah,
the
I was
founder's
going to say,
name.
yeah, the CEO video and the history of the company from the very beginning. If those can be dropped as well, like that's my plea. They might be, maybe page 3 and 4 after
Yes,
the
later.
we.
Yeah.
Yeah, if they can go in the bin forever, that would be amazing. Yeah,
Let's teach you how to do the job first, and then we'll worry about what year were we founded.
yeah, yeah. The story's relevant in some roles,
Yeah.
but mostly not. Yeah, I'm with you on that. Okay, all right. Well, let's imagine that's happening. Everyone's ditching slide 2 and 3 and 4 if they've been listening to the rest. What's something about frontline workers that continues to inspire you or impress you?
Writing a book about frontline workers for the past 2 years has been an interesting experience. Even when you add on to the fact that I've spent 25 years doing this work, thinking about this audience and being a member of these types of operations. But talking directly to people who do the jobs, as well as people who support people in these jobs, because most of the people I worked with on the book, I'd never met before. We hadn't worked together. Some people I've collaborated with on different projects or know professionally, but I met a lot of new people along the way. And what they reinforced from frontline workers, frontline managers, L&D, HR practitioners, operations team members, executives that I spoke with, all reinforced this idea that the potential impact of what we do is bigger than we often recognize. We often think about, well, it's about doing the job, meeting compliance requirements, hitting the goal, reaching the KPI. That's what we're doing. And yes, that's what we need to be acting in service of, because enabling frontline workers can't be an altruistic pursuit. It's the right thing to do to provide people the level of support they need to feel good about their job, feel capable, comfortable, confident on the job. But it needs to be in service of outcomes that are prioritized by the business. Absolutely. But when we do this right, we have an ability to change people's lives that I think is unique when it comes to the nature of frontline work. And that's why the last story in the book, the entire time I was writing, I wanted the last word to be from the frontline workforce, because it's their story, not mine, even though there's a lot of anecdotes from me in this book. It's very much about the people who do this job. So the last part of the book is called The Last Word. And it's a story of an individual who works in the construction business, who reflects on his experience on the job, how he got into the space, how he was supported by his company over the years, and what it's meant, not just for him professionally, but for his family along the way. And it's a great example of when we do it right, and when an organization properly prioritizes and supports their frontline teams, drives business results as a result of that investment, but also what it does for the people who are doing the job. And I think that was reinvigorated throughout the course of this process, because I think it's very easy to get disconnected and just think about kind of the day-to-day operational outcomes, meeting compliance requirements, and kind of lose sight of the fact that there's a much bigger outcome to be had if we're able to do this well.
Okay, amazing. That's a great note to leave our conversation on. Just remind the listeners of the name of your book and where they can find it.
Sure. It's the Frontline Enablement Playbook, available now for pre-order, coming out May 5th, 2026. You can find more information about the book as well as links to pre-order at frontlineplaybook.com. Or if you're a fan of fun URLs, the book is also available at jdwroteanotherbook.com, because my first book, The Modern Learning Ecosystem, is available at jdwroteabook.com. Do I own the URL jdwroteathirdbook.com? That's for you to find out. Frontlineplaybook.com drops on May 5th. And again, thank you to everyone who collaborated with me on the book. So many people contributed their time, insights, and perspective. And thanks to everyone out there who prioritizes the frontline workforce in your everyday work.
Amazing. And we'll also put a link to the book and to yourself, JD, and your LinkedIn profile on the write-up of the podcast. So I'm going to say a massive thank you for joining me today. It's been fascinating diving into the world, the massive world of frontline, which I think is still fairly misunderstood, despite the fact it's billions and billions of people, our neighbours, our friends, etc., that make up that masses. So yeah, thank you for talking to us today.
My pleasure.